Good evening, afternoon, and morning for some folks, but good day to everyone. This is Terry Brennan. I'm going to be going through a presentation connecting ITSM and DevOps and talking about the idea of continuous operations and the idea that the sum is greater for the parts than the parts in those cases. So, as I said, my name is Terry Brennan. I'm Managing Director with ORC Software. Just a couple seconds on my background. I've been in the technology space for a long time, been fortunate enough to be sort of on the leading edges of some of the different techniques that came along, everywhere from way back when object-oriented development started up and going up through the ranks on the development side, moved into operations and did a lot in operations and on the ITSM, ITIL side. Also got into Agile when Agile was early on and was fortunate enough to live in that, and more recently have also moved within the DevOps side. So a pretty broad background, I like to say. I've sort of been in dev and ops and governance and management strategy, so I can sort of connect the dots between those. So we're going to connect some dots this morning, going through and talking about ITSM and DevOps and how those can sort of work together. So enough about me. Sorry about that. So agenda-wise, we're going to talk about four main areas and subjects, if you will. One, the idea of alien worlds. Seems like sometimes these different approaches come from different worlds. We'll walk through that. We'll talk about continuous and sort of what that means in the DevOps and ITSM world. Connecting points, so what does it look like to build a bridge? Where are those connecting points between those different techniques? And then finally, how do we marry those? So if we're talking about using those in conjunction, what does some of that start to look like? So the first thing we're going to talk about is something you hear or we hear when we're working with clients. ITSM and DevOps, they're really from different worlds? Are they competing? And often we see that idea that they are. So if you think of aliens versus predator, the warring over the earth and trying to gain dominance. Sometimes that's what it seems like, but in reality, it's very different than that. There's a lot for them to work together. And to leverage each other's connections and their strengths. But a lot of times there is the perception that they're very different. So let's look at each of them together and then maybe in the contrast. So if from the DevOps side, that may be, you can almost think of that as planet change. So, change is a big thing in DevOps, speed, agility, moving fast. It's a big drawing point and a big rallying cry for DevOps, and it's something that certainly people focus on. So if we think about DevOps, it is a challenging term, if you will, because everybody thinks of it different. Some people think of it as just tools. Other folks think of it as automation. Some look at it as the pipeline. So you may have heard the idea of the CI/CD pipeline. And then others look at it as everything. Taking into account everything that goes on. And it's bits and pieces of all of those, but let's define it a little bit so at least in the terms of this conversation, we can be aligned on what we're going to talk about. So DevOps overall, one key piece of it is it's a blending of dev and ops, and really beyond. It includes QA if they're separated out, security, and other groups. But really, if you think the term dev and ops, it's sort of bringing those together so that they work more tightly with one another in a more coordinated fashion. From an identified need to deployed value in production. One piece that's very confusing when looking at DevOps is where's the beginning and end? And there's not a defined point. It's not as defined as some other areas. But if you just overall think of it, hey, I have a code change that needs to be built and applied, and how does that move through and get deployed for value into production? It connects people, process, and tools, and we always say culture as well, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. really bringing all those together. So, back to that earlier slide, is it all about automation or tools? It's about those, yes, but it's more than that. It's about the people, the process, the tools, the culture, and the connections between them. And it's got a lean foundation and a focus on culture, automation, and continuous flow, which is going to be a key concept as we get into this. So overall, we can look at it's the blending of dev and ops across the overall life cycle from identified need to deployed value and production that connects the people, process, tools with a lean foundation and a focus on culture, automation, and continuous flow. So it's still a lot, but that at least gives us some guidance to what it is. So looking at that, at maybe that next level, DevOps overall has a lot of common practices. There's quite a few because it covers a broad spectrum. You may be familiar with or heard things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and the pipeline overall that sort of runs across. But there's a lot of different practices that get applied across that. You'll hear things like automated. You'll hear things like doing things once and then reusing it, everything as code. So you'll see a lot of these terms and a lot of these ideas, but really they're trying to bridge and connect all these pieces across this pipeline. So we look at the pipeline, it's a broad set of activities and things that happen, on the front end, sort of from the continuous integration side. It's things like the SCM, the source code management and the development, obviously build the integration, but also test. There's pieces sort of cross and use different areas, things like orchestration, release management, ticketing, communication, collaboration. So now you start to see where these can intersect quite a bit with ITSM. And then the CD side, things like provisioning, deployment management, infrastructure management, and others. These are all components of sort of the DevOps world. On the other side, let's talk a moment about ITSM, plan and control, at least that's sometimes how it's perceived. So again, if you're thinking of it as the opposite world, that's sort of where it starts to look like. So plan and control, if we think of it ITSM, it's a little bit more settled and still be a little bit confusing because there's obviously multiple frameworks that can support it. Probably the best known and the one we'll use for a lot of comparisons today is ITIL. So it's a big piece of it and pretty well known. So we'll talk through that. And looking at it from the ITIL perspective, we'll look how some of these things link into the idea of lean and continuous and how that ties into DevOps. And there's a lot of, they've got a very good structure and a lot of different pieces. And some of the things we'll talk about are things like the value stream, the idea of value stream, the guiding principles that really come into play and where those come from, the idea of continual improvement and what that looks like. And then we'll dive in for where there's a lot of connections into some of the practices. And practices is probably something that a lot of the folks that are listening in are familiar with. The ITIL practices, they're set up with service management practice, general management practice, technical management practice. And when you look at those, there's a lot of different supporting practices that help tie together and help you effectively manage your services and bring a lot of discipline and capability to the equation. And what we'll talk about is how some of these align and have touch points into DevOps and that side of the world and how they can be complementary. That's how it's overall set up. So looking at sort of ITSM and DevOps, when people think of them and try to think of them as different worlds, they often have different opinions or ideas on what the other represents. If you're on the ITSM side, sometimes you'll hear them, oh, DevOps, that's change chaos, it's unstructured, it's all about software, it's unproven, it's cowboy, it's free for all. If you're on the DevOps side and they're looking at the other side, sometimes they'll say things like, hey, it's very controlled, it's structured or rigid, it forgets about software, it's old, it's bureaucratic, it's siloed. And neither of these are really true, but sometimes that's a misconception that one side versus the other will have, and versus working together and bringing the strengths, sometimes they can sit on different sides and sort of have misconceptions about what the other side and the other framework, the other capabilities actually are, and may not think of how those things can be leveraged both together and how they need to work in conjunction, but also how they can work to expand and be very complementary of one another. So you can see, especially when people are talking about these different terms, where this perception of alien worlds and sort of warring faction comes together. But in reality, it's much different than that. The reality is there's a lot of shared ideals, lean ideals and other common goals that go between the different approaches. So if you look at it, certainly improving quality and reducing time and cost, eliminating waste, the idea of continuous improvement, the idea that you've got to look across people, process, and technology, they're all core to both sides of that equation. And so there's a lot more commonality than there is difference. So let's talk about that. So continuous and sort of that lean, and what does it mean for ITSM and DevOps worlds? So one thing that probably everybody is fairly aware of is the world's changing. There is an acceleration in the evolving business needs. At the business level, the changes that need to be applied and need to be cycled in the environment is moving much more quickly. And that's an expectation of end customers and the business teams that support that. In addition, you've got the agile delivery cycle. So these ideas of shorter and shorter cycles have sort of been maturing for a while now. I go back, I first actually started doing agile in probably the mid 90s, late 90s, before it was actually called agile, before the manifesto. So the way of executing in sort of that iterative agile way has been around for a while, but it's really taken hold and it started to change how things flow through our life cycles and the impact that has on us as IT professionals in delivering that and delivering that value for our business and for the customers. So it really does accelerate the need for world-class IT and things to be fast, stable, secure, and reliable. To bring a little data to it, an interesting report. It's on the DevOps side, but it's really applicable overall to the impact on technology and IT and dev organizations on the business and what having improvements in gaining efficiencies and continuously improving that can bring to the equation. So it's State of DevOps. This is out of the 2019 report. Very interesting in that they base these things on different levels. The top level is elite performers. The bottom level they call low performers. And when you look at that contrast, the top 20% of organizations, those elites, they're moving many times faster than the low performers, but they're also doing it with a higher level of quality. So when you dig into some of the numbers they produce, if you look at this first one, this is around how frequently deployments are done. So they are deploying over 200 times as often as the low performers. If you look at how fast their lead times, how from commit to deployed into production, they're moving over 100 times faster. If you look at their ability to recovery from problems and failures, over 2,600 times faster. And they're doing all of this, with the key, with actually higher quality. So they're doing with 7 times lower failure rates. And those are some pretty dramatic numbers, and it has an impact on the business, which is why this really becomes critical. So if we look here overall, enabling this gap, or this gap that's growing between these elite performers here and low performers, is actually driving a change in business, if you will. So this business, between the elite and the low performers, the elite performers are over 1.5 times more likely to meet or exceed their goals for organizational performance. And that's things like productivity, profitability, customer service. So you can see as this grows, and that gap grows, that is a pretty significant competitive advantage that needs to be driven. So organizations are turning to things like lean concepts and approaches that leverage those, like DevOps and ITSM or ITIL, and that bring some of these things to bear, bringing things, optimizing the whole, eliminating waste, building quality in, knowledge about people. And they're looking to be able to drive these concepts because they need to be able to move quickly. They need to be able to move with confidence, and they need to be able to drive it in with quality. So you can't just move fast and then produce poor quality, but you can't just have quality and not move fast. So it's figuring out how to balance that and how to work within that world. So there's a lot of concepts that then come into play that you see across these different spectrums. Things like value stream and the idea of value stream mapping, so understanding how we deliver value from beginning to end within the spectrum, and applying that to more of an IT standpoint, especially when you look truly beginning to end, that impacts a lot of different areas across the board. The idea of continuous improvement, or as they call kaizens, this idea that you always have to improve, you need to be looking all the time and sort of ingrain it into what you do, is another thing businesses are often looking to really establish and grow within their businesses so they can move more quickly. And finally, this idea of continuous flow, something moving towards smaller batches, being able to move changes, and in our case, software or service level changes that are coming through all the time, and be able to move that through in hopefully a fairly continuous type of action rather than a bunch of stops and starts. So we look at continuous within DevOps, and we think about what the impacts are there. From a DevOps standpoint, if you think of the idea here and development sort of iterating here and changes moving through this pipeline as we go, that's where ideally what you're trying to do with DevOps is bring this together and be able to connect these in a way that allows for those changes to flow as continuously and unimpeded as possible. But in reality, it's a journey, and people are very different spots. A lot of people haven't started that at all. It's still manual, it's still siloed, it's still very fractured. Many people have moved into that first generation where things are still really siloed, but they're starting to get some automation. So at least they're getting some pieces of building that repeatability and that consistency that they have. The second generation, they've now sort of broken down this business. It's not business as usual. They've started to think about how do they build the connective tissue between the organizations so that these things work well. And then finally, as folks really mature, it goes beyond that typical piece, and it's something we'll talk about a little bit later, the idea of bringing continuous flow throughout. So the idea of really re-engineering and looking at your overall value stream from beginning to end and across the different areas, so that now it's providing a much more continuous and rapid, but with confidence and quality and the assurance that you're going to be delivering good value that is reliable and stable for your clients. So we tie that together, and really, if you think about it, it's really going from this idea of disjointed, where we have big batches moving through, and each one of those sort of hits a spot, where they have to do something like a build or something like that. And it sort of stops here because there's a lot to do, it's significant in size, and that costs time, dollars, resource. And that happens at each place. It may be where we got to get the environments, it may be where we're having to deploy, it may be where we're having to do things like database and test and try to move it into production. Each of these is very disjointed, very manual, time-consuming, and difficult to do, especially if you have to cycle it a lot. The overall goal in going to continuous is to start to try to move this so that's now going through this in a fairly continuous way, an automated way, that is both consistent and can provide confidence that we're delivering with quality and with a minimum risk. If we look at the continuous in the ITSM spectrum, and particularly in the ITIL spectrum that we're comparing against today, there's a lot of places where lean is come into play and sort of a pieces of it. You look at the idea of the value stream, you look within that, the idea of service chains, continual improvement, the idea of focusing on these guiding principles and what these drive, and its ability to hook in and sort of live with and connect to and support other areas such as DevOps. So there's a lot of connections on the ITIL side as well when you start looking at V4. and utilizing ideas with value streams and truly looking at it as, how do I move through this? How do I produce the value on this end, coming from something like my demand on this end? So leveraging that type of concept and thinking about these at a high level, so you understand and can start to see where there's maybe some blockages or problems in here in your process, allows you to drive some of that continual improvement thought. It allows you to continue to leverage the different practices and processes across the board and bring those together in a way that delivers and maximizes the value you can deliver to your customer, your client. Continual improvement, it is baked in. It is a piece of ITIL. So that idea of building this both into what you do, but really making it a mindset, something that's built into your culture that you're continually doing, is one of the key foundational pieces for ITIL and driving that forward. Now we're going to talk about some of the connecting points. So, we've talked about sort of what each of those are. We've talked about how those sort of align to the idea of continuous lean and some of the things they share among them. Now we're going to talk about how we sort of bridge those. So, when we talked in the beginning, the perception or misconception that, these are sort of warring alien worlds, it is really just that. There's a lot that they can do together, and there's lots of ways that they can leverage each other to do a lot. So we're going to talk in this section about how these things connect. So how can they be complementary and connected cohorts rather than working on opposite ends of the spectrum? And if you look within ITIL, especially when you look down at some of the practice, there's a lot of connecting points to DevOps and some of the things that happen in DevOps. And that's why it's important for these to work together, because they're both sort of touching some of the same areas. Some are more direct than others. Certainly when you start to look at things like monitoring, and you start to look at things, where's our change enablement and release management, and you look at these practices in here, in particular around deployment and infrastructure and platform management, there's a lot of areas where there's crossover and pieces that come into play. And even the general pieces, when you start looking at things like organizational change and the cultural impacts and things of that nature. So there are a lot of connecting points across the practices, especially in your service management and your technical management aspects of what's going on with ITIL. And for organizations that have a strong ITIL and ITSM, sort of mature practices and pieces in place, and now DevOps is coming in, there are areas where they're going to be working and having to figure out how to make that work together. Same thing on the DevOps side. So, DevOps coming into ITIL, again, there are lots of places where there are connections and related activities, whether that's things like the SEM, testing, how you go across the more obvious ones like release management, deployment management, and infrastructure management, monitoring, lots of different areas where from a DevOps standpoint, these are things where there are practices, goals, if you will, and things in place that they're trying to drive out. But it's important to figure out how these things actually connect back and are leverage things that may be good, solid, existing practices that are in place today, and work to figure out the best path forward in modifying and continually improving those, versus staying separate and not thinking about those, or we're taking those into consideration. So if we look at these two together, and this is not all of them, but we'll see there's lots of places, from the places within the guiding principles, things like, in particular, when you really look at this optimize and automate, when you look in some of the detailed practices like change enablement and release management, again, those sort of relate. Monitoring, the idea of continual improvement, it's sort of key for both sides, and working down into things like organizational change management, which pulls the culture, and deployment management, going to deployment within the DevOps world. So we're going to talk about a couple of these in a little bit of detail. Obviously, we won't go through all of them, but ones that come up and are fairly common, certainly change management, change enablement, It's a big one, and often this is where you can see some of the contrast in styles or what folks are trying to do. The change control sort of processes and a lot of these have been in place and are well established. They've got a weekly cadence. They may be manual. There's probably something like a CAB in a review process, but they're fairly formal. They're established and they're in place for good reason, and they are trying to obviously have some level of control. On the other side, you have DevOps coming down, and often it's got changes or triggered event, and that's sometimes, well, in some folks' goals, they want to be able to push it all the way through. That's a big task to be able to do that, repeatedly and in a safe way. And I've actually had clients. I had one client who they made a high level goal, and they wanted to take this sort of beginning to end, and they only wanted one manual step in that process, which was just before it went into production, and it was just basically a almost a confirmation. So very different than the process that had been set up earlier. But then you start to look at what that really entails. Do you have all the automated testing, all the automated deployment, the automated rollback, all the pieces that you would need to have the confidence to do that? And the answer was no. So it ended up being moving that back. And again, you have to figure out how to balance it. So we want control and we want speed, but it's a balancing act that we have to be able to adjust to make happen. So this is one area where you often see the two different approaches coming together and having to figure out how to work together, because they're both trying to provide value and the right value to this equation. It's a matter of how do you adjust those so you're able to accomplish those in the way that makes most sense for your organization. There are organizations that do allow things to flow directly through, but they've made significant investments in being able to do things like that. The vast majority of organizations that at least we see, they're not at that point. They need control. They still need those reviews. It's just it may change up a little bit in how they do it. Another common place where there's a lot of overlap is deployment management, and they both are trying to really equate the same thing, and they have different aspects to it. But it's really trying to take this idea of deployment, and still in many cases today is a very fearful sort of activity where you're on conference calls and up all night, and you're hoping that it's going to go well. You're camped out in the conference room, well, maybe not as much today, but in the conference room, and then you hit that deploy, and you just hope it goes well. First, where we're trying to get to on both sides is really something that is automated, and that we've built in the quality and consistency checks that allow us to deploy with confidence, deploy the same way each time, and for that to have been well tested and well established beforehand. So both these areas are sort of driving towards that same ideal and trying to make that happen. And then the other area we'll talk on a little bit in details, this guiding principle, if you will, from an ITIL standpoint of optimize and automate. And if you go back to one of the earlier slides, we talked about sort of DevOps. Sometimes people think basically all it is automation, which is not the case. It shouldn't be the case. It's not all that it is. You need to take a lot more into consideration. But obviously, from a DevOps standpoint, it's an important piece of the equation. And just as it is with the guiding principle from an ITIL, ITSM standpoint, it's a guiding principle and a sort of foundational part of how, in this fairly complex ecosystem, do I start to put things like automation in place so that I can have confidence that if things are moving through this pipeline, one, they're doing it with quality. Hopefully they're doing it with speed, and they're doing it with some idea of continuous, and be able to drive that out. So this is another area where we see both these bringing a lot to the table, having thoughts and ways to do it, that they need to work together to be able to really help each other and accent each other's strengths and bring in some of the areas that are maybe a little bit more gaps. But there are a lot of connections that come in, on this guiding principle as well. So if we look now, so we talked about what these are. We've talked about, some of the things that are driving it and driving it to continuous. We've talked about what that means. We've talked about how those things connect and how they actually come into play together. Now we're going to talk about how do we actually marry. How do we make the sum greater than the parts, and what does that start to look like? So one concept we've talked about throughout this is the idea of continuous flow and the capabilities that can support that. And if you think of it from the standard DevOps pieces, this is where a lot of times people pretty much box DevOps into, is continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. So that it is driving these things through. But there's a lot more that come into play throughout this. One is it's the things that are feeding it. So what comes into this and how do you drive it? And that's things like continuous integration and continuous planning. Another is, how am I running? What am I doing? And things like continuous transition and continuous operations. And there's a lot of places where DevOps and ITIL and ITSM can work together in this area. And we're going to talk about these in more detail as we get going. Then if you really take this to the broader sense, it's what's being overseen and what's being, sort of the strategy, the management, and the visibility overall for the organization. And then there's supporting ideas. So there's some specialized pieces that we often work with folks on, things like continuous testing, continuous data, continuous improvement, and so other areas like continuous monitoring. The whole idea is moving towards, because you're not going to get there in one jump, this idea of better flow, more continuous flow, and to be able to address and drive those out. It takes a lot of approaches working together, because when you look at that overall picture, there's a lot of different pieces that come into play. There's a lot of pieces that have to sort of come together. And certainly ITSM and ITIL can bring a piece of that. DevOps brings a piece of that. But there's others like SRE, and there's others like Agile and others that all need to come together to sort of play a piece in that equation and how they drive those out. It also takes continuous improvement really across these approaches, because none of these are static. This is not a static type of item and area. These are all sort of living and breathing, or should be living and breathing areas that sort of change over time, changing to the environment, changing to requirements, changing to the overall changes in the industry and other things that are driving out. But overall, we're moving to continuous flow and trying to make those work a little bit better. So we have two areas that we're going to focus on today that aim to do just that. And when we think of this overall equation, the biggest areas where there's a lot of areas where you can leverage both the DevOps ideas and the ideas of ITIL and ITSM is in that sort of that boundary between where things are coming out of development and moving to more of an ongoing basis. Because there are concepts out there. If we think about the SREs and the way some of those groups can work, we think about no-ops. So there's other places where maybe they've changed that up. There's not as much of a boundary. But what we see in the vast majority of the cases is there is somebody that's going to support this long term. There is often some type of transition, ideally some type of transition that occurs in this process. So we're going to talk about these two areas and just dive into these and talk about how it can be supported and what that starts to look like. The first one we're going to talk about is the idea of continuous transition. And again, this is really that boundary between those two. And unfortunately, for many years, I've worked on and setting up, we used to call them transition processes, but the idea that when it's coming out of development, whether that's something small or big product, whatever it may be, it shouldn't be an event. to just move that over and transition that into more of an ongoing and operational standpoint. It's got to be a lot more than that. And that's where some of the DevOps concepts certainly come into play and drive that out. But it shouldn't be an event. So what I always used to try to say is it's not an event, it should be a process. It's something that should happen over time, that we should break down these silos and start embedding people into the organization and driving it from that standpoint. Well, over recent times, that's changed even again to this idea that, yeah, it's a process, but it shouldn't be something we think of as we just execute every once in a while. It too needs to move towards the idea of continuous. So, especially as we have smaller pieces that are moving in a much more rapid fashion, we need to have a way to understand and set up and do this on a continuous basis. And to do that, you need to be able to think, well, what does that mean? What are the pieces that would come to play? And that's what we've really developed with the idea of continuous transition. So it's really trying to say, okay, it's not everything. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's if you're going to move to this and you're starting to move into this direction, what are the things you have to start thinking about? One of those we talked about is this idea of shifting left, moving things earlier in the process, as early as possible. And that may be that you're embedding operations support people earlier, and they're a piece of that equation, and then you're even keeping on developers as the, if you will, break-in period for new functionality, new capabilities comes in. But it's building up a true support transition. So taking that as a discipline and making sure that that is rigorous, especially as these are happening much more frequently. Setting up a real idea of continuous learning. So again, that it's not, if you go back to the way it probably still is quite often, it is that event, and it's an event where something gets thrown over the wall, and then it's something that is not understood. There's no training on, there's maybe no documentation, there's been no knowledge transfer, there's no been pairing, things of that nature haven't occurred because, again, the idea of continuous learning hasn't been put in place. The idea of operational readiness and be able to address that, automating as much as possible. It's beneficial both when you're in the transition and to keep it ongoing, so that's important then. Our communication and collaboration, it's a discipline on both sides, both from an ITIL and from a DevOps standpoint, that's important, but it's something that's got to be set up and thought about, and how you keep that going, especially again as the volume and the frequency and the speed at which these things are moving through happens. And then things like continuous monitoring, that ability to set that up and know when these things go, are they working as anticipated? Are we seeing problems so that we can move it back? And of course, with all of these, that sort of gets wrapped with this idea of change culture, or changing the culture and aligning the people in the organization. So talking about a couple of these in a little bit of detail, continuous transition, when you think about the shifting left, it's really moving those early as possible in the equation. You hear this a lot in testing and some of the other areas. How do you start to move these earlier so that I'm aware of them? Things like the operational requirements and learning, resource engagement. How do I move those forward? Setting up a support transition plan and process. How do I actually do this? Am I doing things like pairing? How am I scaling? What's the acceptance? What does readiness look like? And finally, that idea of continuous learning, where I've got knowledge management, training, pairing, postmortems where there's problems, and updated documentation available so that I know the ongoing team is up to speed and ready to be able to handle these new changes and these new applications or products that are coming down the line. The other area we're going to talk about is continuous operation. So, that transition is really taking it from the team that's been working on it and moving it to an ongoing standpoint and embedding or breaking down the silos, integrating those in the best way possible. Well, continuous operations is now, once that gets going, how do I start to really think of that from an overall continuous standpoint and drive some of these practices? So, it is things like applying some agile practices. It is doing service management integration. So you're getting very specific on how do I pull into a lot of these ideas and these concepts so that my changes that are coming often and frequent or more frequent are now able to fit into this, and I'm able to do things like capacity planning and my availability management and all these other aspects that I've got to address how do I intertwine and integrate those into what's happening from that standpoint? It really improves or increases that important collaboration and automation. The idea of continuous feedback and building the feedback loops, so that now as we get feedback both from our clients in ways of potentially incidents, issues, defects and problems, things that we have to go figure out, how do we build those loops in so that we can get that into that life cycle and that potential pipeline that can move quickly, but how do I actually feed that in and make that continuous? And then how do I integrate these things? So overall, you start to think of some of the things on the outside edge that feed into a lot of the pipelines, your Jira, your ticketing, things like that. How do I make sure those integrate in, and what I'm seeing and what I'm driving is all connected within the process? And then the idea of continuous verification, which we'll talk about momentarily. And then just like in continuous transition, a lot of times the cultural and org and people changes are very different to work in this manner. So you have to really be able to take in the OCM, the organizational change management ideas, the cultural impacts, and figure out what it means, because it may be changing how people work. It may change who they work with. Oftentimes there's some fear, uncertainty, and doubt that creeps in that you got to figure out how to address. So talking about a couple of these in a little bit of detail. So continuous verification, once we get these things up and running, we truly need to be able to figure out how do we monitor. And this is, yes, maybe at an infrastructure level, the typical things like CPU and others, but also at an overall APM, so an application performance monitoring, cloud, how do I monitor my cloud? Now containers are starting in. So each of these layer on different types of monitoring, but getting that monitoring in place, being able to set that up so you can continually verify that it's up and working and well, figuring out how you work in your log management and your analytics to look at that so that it's not just a bunch of data. And that's one of the challenges with driving to automated and all these tools and all these connection points and all these components begin to end, is there's a lot of data. You actually have to be able to figure out what the data is telling you and make use of that data. So that takes some focus there. And then pipeline integration, and we've talked about, it's important to look across that life cycle, especially when you start to move into that transition and ongoing operations, continuous operations standpoint, and make sure these things are still connected so that they're not out of sync, and that you're able to connect that feedback loop, but also connect that cycle so it can run effectively and hopefully in a continuous way going forward. So that's looking across and looking at things like your tool chain, looking at your processes, and figuring out both how those need to connect from a process standpoint, a people standpoint, and then if you're using tools for the orchestration and driving of those, how do you leverage those? How do you connect those? How do you leverage the data for those so you can continue forward in a efficient manner? And then finally, we'll look at cultural and alignment. They're critical throughout this whole process. And yes, they're a piece we talked about within continuous transition and continuous operations. But really within this whole spectrum, getting cultural alignment, being sensitive to what the culture is and understanding how what you may be trying to put in place, especially as you broaden these out to a broader set of organizations in different groups, that you need to understand where they're at and how they can, if you will, start to get experience, start to get exposure, how you can change maybe their mindset into some of these areas. So it's a blending a lot of times of different perspectives and different cultural aspects, and then figuring out how you align the organizations overall to move those forward. Because again, it's bigger than any one piece, especially when you go for that continuous flow across the organization. There's a lot of different frameworks, there's a lot of different approaches, and sort of ITIL and DevOps are a couple of them, but there's others that need to be aligned to as well and brought into the equation and figured out how to use the best pieces of those, but align those to the lower pieces. So we went through today, and really we went from the beginning where we're talking about ITSM and DevOps, and we're talking about these being very, very different worlds, sort of warring factions, where they're taking very different approaches, and the realization and working towards the idea that they're really connected partners living on the same world. We're all part of that same equation. There's other pieces on here on the other side that you can't see, right? That are other frameworks that have to be in play. But in particular, ITSM and ITIL and DevOps share a lot of things that are both in common and that we need to connect on. And then there's a lot that we can bring from the strengths of each of these areas to really be able to make things flow and execute smoothly. So that's our talk for today. I know we're right up on time. Again, my name was Terry Brennan, and you can reach me at the contact information below. I appreciate everybody's time, and we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.